this stage say that both of you have been very cooperative to this committee, and we have appreciated that. You have answered questions for a long time, and I would like to apologise on behalf of the committee and Parliament for the way you have been treated, and I will make a report to the Speaker, and I assure you we will take action to try and find out how that was able to occur. But it is extremely good of you to agree to continue the session and to allow my colleague Louise Mensch just to finish her questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
And if I may start by saying, Messrs Murdoch, that I said on Sky News when discussing your initial appearance that it would have showed guts and leadership for you to show up today and answer questions. And I must say, I think it shows immense guts, Mr Rupert Murdoch, for you to continue answering questions now under the circumstances, under such a lengthy evidence session, and I thank you for it.
Thank you.
My questions will be just as tough as ever they would have been had that unfortunate incident not have occurred. So, Mr James Murdoch, if I can just take you back briefly before we were so rudely interrupted to the question of the disparity between the settlements, could you please tell me whether or not the Taylor settlement, to your knowledge, involved a confidentiality clause that was not present in the settlement for the lesser amount of money?
I can tell you that the Taylor settlement was a confidential settlement, and as to other settlements post that and more recent settlements, some have been confidential. I believe some have been confidential, some have not. I don't believe any have been confidential settlements, but I can certainly follow up as to whether or not there have been any. It's customary to, in an out-of-court settlement of this nature, for both sides, of both parties to agree. There's nothing unusual about an out-of-court settlement being made confidential and being agreed to being confidential. But it was, and with respect to, I think the basis of the question, which was about the disparity in the amount of money involved,
Indeed.
There was nothing in the Taylor settlement with respect to confidentiality that spoke to the amount of money. The amount of money was derived, as I testified earlier, from a judgment made about what the likely damages would be and what the likely expenses and litigation costs would have been had the company taken the litigation to its end and lost.
Yes, you've been very clear about that is your explanation for the size of the settlement. I merely put it to you that an inference could be drawn if the larger settlements contained confidentiality clauses and the smaller settlements did not, that despite what you say about it being a pragmatic decision based on the costs to the company of not settling, an inference could be drawn that silence was being bought by the presence of the confidentiality clause in the larger settlements.
And that inference would be false.
Okay, fair enough. Many people, I think this is the nub of it, will find it quite hard to believe that two executives whom nobody would regard as passive had such little knowledge of widespread illegality at one of your flagship papers. Can I ask you very specifically, Mr. James Murdoch first, when did you become aware that the phones not merely of celebrities and members of the royal family but of victims of crime had been hacked? When did you become aware that the phone of the murder victim Millie Dowler had been hacked?
The terrible instance of voicemail interception around the Millie Dowler case only came to my attention when it was reported in the press a few weeks ago.
So
and
only
it was
when the Guardian reported it?
It was
that
a
specific?
total, and I can tell you it was a total shock. That was the first that I had heard of it and became aware of it.
And is that the same for hacking of other victims of crime? In other words, have you been made aware prior to the Millie Dowler story breaking that your reporters hacked into the phones of any other crime victims?
No, I had not been made aware of that.
Okay. And just for the record, though you answered this to my colleague Jim Sheridan earlier, but you'll be aware it's a very lively interest to regulators in the United States. The actor Jude Law is apparently alleging that his phone was hacked on US soil. Given that allegation, are you absolutely confident that no employee or contractor of News Corp or any of its properties hacked the phones of 9/11 victims or their families?
We have no evidence of that at all.
Have any credible allegations? I see you hesitating, Mr. James.
No, I was just going to say. Sorry. I was just going to say that those are incredibly serious allegations, and they've come to light very recently. We do not know the veracity of those allegations and are trying to understand precisely what they are and any investigations. I remember well, as all of us do, the September 11th attacks, and I was in the Far East, living there at the time, and it is just appalling to think that anyone associated with one of our papers would have done something like that. I'm aware of no evidence about that. I'm well aware of the allegations and will eagerly cooperate with any investigations or try to find out what went on at that time. This is very, very new allegations, just a few days old, I think, but they're very serious allegations, and that sort of activity would have absolutely no place. It would be appalling.
From the information provided to you so far, I noted Mr. Rupert Murdoch's answer was emphatic. Your answer, Mr. James Murdoch, was somewhat more nuanced. Have you received any information that gives you cause for concern that employees of News Corp or contractors in News Corp may have indulged in that kind of hacking? No, not at this point. We've only seen the allegations that have been made in the press. I think it was in the Mirror or something like that. So we are actively trying to. We'd like to know exactly what those allegations are and how to understand,
You
have
seen
about
no
them.
internal documents, memos, records, or received any verbal reports that any employee of News Corp hacked into the phone of Nyland. Fine, thank you.
Definitely not.
Thank you. And have you, as a result of a wider review, clearly this has been a shock to your corporate culture, have you heard from any of your employees of papers in other countries that phone hacking, blagging or illegal practices may have been happening in those territories, in your Australian properties, or in any territory indeed where News Corp owns media properties? Are you doing a global review, and have you heard of any allegations of phone hacking in your other territories?
I am not aware of any allegations in any of those other territories. I haven't heard of those allegations, but I would go back to the code of ethics and code of conduct that all of our colleagues at News Corporation globally, be they journalists or management, are required to have when they join the company and are briefed on those things. It is a matter of real seriousness, the journalistic ethics of any of the newspapers or television channels within the group, and certainly it's something that on a global basis, we want to be consistent. We want to be doing the right thing, and when I say that illegal behavior has no place in this company, that goes for the whole company.
Mr. Rupert Murdoch, you are the chairman and chief executive of News Corp. You are the head of the global company. The buck stops with you. Given these allegations that you have said, indeed when you opened the session you said that this was the most humiliating day of your life, given the...
Humble.
Oh, I'm sorry, humble, I beg your pardon. That is a mistake. The most humble day of your life. You feel humbled by these events. You are ultimately in charge of the company. Given your shock at these things being laid out before you and the fact that you didn't know anything about them, have you instructed your editors around the world to engage in a root and branch review of their own newsrooms to be sure that this isn't being replicated in other News Corp papers around the globe? And if not, will you do so?
No, but I am more than prepared to do so.
Thank you. One final question, or two final questions. The first is, you touched earlier, Mr. James Murdoch, on, very briefly, you touched on the general culture of phone hacking, blagging and illegal practices that has in the past happened in this country. If I could put a couple of things to you. Piers Morgan, who is now a celebrity anchor at CNN, who do not appear to have asked him any questions at all about phone hacking, as a former editor of the Daily Mirror. He said in his book, The Insider, recently, and I quote, that the little trick of entering a standard 4-digit code allow anyone to call a number and hear all your messages. In that book, he boasted that using that little trick enables him to win Scoop of the Year on a story about Sven-Goran Eriksson. So that is a former editor of the Daily Mirror being very open about his personal use of phone hacking. Yesterday in Parliament, Paul Dacre, and indeed he was a former News of the World executive, he was boasting about a story that happened when he was the editor of the Daily Mirror. Yesterday, Paul Dacre of Associated Newspapers said to a committee of Parliament, in my view, risibly, that the Daily Mail has never in its history run a story based on phone hacking or blagging in any way. Yet Operation Motorman, of which I'm sure you, Mr. James Murdoch, your advisors will have made you aware, found the Daily Mail had 50 journalists paying for 902 pieces of information obtained by the private investigator Steve Whitmore, who have been found to have used some, shall we say, unorthodox methods. You told me earlier, Mr. Murdoch, that your advisors in prepping you to come before this committee had told you to simply tell the truth, which I think was excellent advice. Is it not the fact, is not the truth of the matter that journalists at the Daily Mail, at the News of the World, felt entitled to go out there and use blagging, deception and phone hacking because that was part of the general culture of corruption in the British tabloid press, and that they didn't kick it up the chain to you because they felt they were entitled to use the same methods as everybody else? Isn't that the plain fact of the matter?
Ms. Mensch, I am aware of those reports, the questions around other newspapers and their use of private investigators. But I think really, all I can really speak to in this matter is the behaviors and the culture at the News of the World as we understand it, how we're trying to find out what really happened in the period in question, but also, and I think importantly, it's not for me here today to impugn other newspapers, other journalists, other things like that. You've asked us.
I'm asking if the News of the World felt inured to engaging in these legal practices, particularly phone hacking, because it was so wide in British tabloid journalism. Didn't they not see it as evil as it was because it was so widespread?
Ms. Mensch, I don't accept that if a journalist on one of our papers or at a television channel or internet news operation feels that they don't have to hold themselves to a higher standard, I think that it's important that we don't say, listen, everybody was doing it and that's why people are doing this. At the end of the day, we have to have a set of standards that we believe in. We have to have titles and journalists who operate to the highest possible standard. And we have to make sure that when they don't live up to that, that they are held to account. And that's really the focus for us.
Mr. Rupert Murdoch, have you considered suing Harbottle and Lewis? Have you considered suing Harbottle and Lewis? You've said in the past that you relied, the reason you did not do an internal investigation, one of your first answers to the gentleman was that you relied on, to my colleague Tom Watson, that you relied on the investigation by the police, the investigation by the Press Complaints Commission, and the investigation undertaken by your solicitors, Harbottle and Lewis, under whose care this enormous pile of documents was found. There's an old saying that if you want something doing, you should do it yourself. In this case, you relied on 3 sets of people, all of whose investigations were severely lacking. Have you considered suing Harbottle and Lewis?
I think any future legal claims or actions in any matter is really a matter for the future. That's not this. Really, today is about how we actually make sure that these things don't happen again
and
get there. So I won't comment or speculate on any future legal matters.
Okay, the file of evidence, you were asked by my colleague Mr. Farrelly if you'd read it yourself and you said no. Under the circumstances where you've relied on other people and advisors and they've severely let your company down, do you not think, Mr. Murdoch, that perhaps both you and Mr. Rupert Murdoch ought to take the time and read through everything in that file yourselves personally? For clarity, Ms. Mensch, I did say that I did read some of the contents of that. They were shown to me, yes. And what I saw was sufficient to know that it should be that the right thing to do was to hand these over to the authorities to help them with their investigations. I understand that, but do you not think that you were shown a representative sample, which can be tricky under the circumstances and the enormous reputational damage, I'm sure you'll be the first to admit, has been done to News Corp? Do you not think that as senior executives of the company you should take the time and read through the entire file so that you're completely apprised of what happened and you're not relying on anybody else?
I'm happy to do so. I think I've seen a bit of it.
Okay. My last question is for you, Mr. Rupert Murdoch. You said that your friend of 52 years, I think, Les Hinton, had stepped down and had resigned because he was in charge of the company at the time. In other words, he said he was the captain of the ship and therefore he resigned. Is it not the case, sir, though, that you, in fact, are the captain of the ship? You are the Chief Executive Officer of News Corp, the global corporation.
It's a very much bigger ship, but yes.
It is a much bigger ship, but you are in charge of it. And as you said in earlier questions, you do not regard yourself as a hands-off chief executive. You work 10 to 12 hours a day. This terrible thing happened on your watch. Mr. Murdoch, have you considered resigning?
No.
Why not?
Because I feel that people I trusted, I'm not saying who, I don't know what level, let me down, and I think they behaved disgracefully and betrayed the company and me, and it's for them to pay. I think that, frankly, I'm the best person to clean this up.
Thank you, Mr. Murdoch, and as I say, I do very much appreciate your immense courage in having seen this session through, despite what the common assault that just happened to you. Thank you.
Thank you. A little theatre doesn't
I will allow Mr. Watson a very brief
on
question at that.
James, if I can call you James, sorry, to differentiate.
Mr. Watson.
When you signed off the Taylor payment, did you see or were you made aware of the full Neville email, the transcript of the hacked voicemail message?
No, I was not aware of that at the time.
So why on earth was it so? I won't go. But you paid an astronomical sum, and there was no reason to.
No, there was every reason to settle the case, given the likelihood of losing the case and given the damages that we had received counsel would be levied.
If Taylor and Clifford are prepared to release their obligation to confidentiality, will you release them from their confidentiality clause so that we can get to the full facts of those particular cases?
I cannot comment on the Clifford matter at all. I wasn't involved in that matter. As to the Taylor matter, it is a confidential agreement. I don't think it's worth exploring hypotheticals in this.
We've got to get the facts of this case. Help us get to the truth. If he removes himself from an obligation, if he allows his papers to be released, will you let your...
Mr. Watson, it's a hypothetical scenario. I'm happy to correspond with the chairman about what specifically more you'd like to know about those settlements.
Why would you want to
other than the detailed testimony I've given you today?
Why would you want to retain? Do you mind me carry on with a few more questions so that I can get to the end of this, or do you want the chairman to...
I'm going to call a halt. I think we have covered this at some considerable length.
Well, we haven't. Actually, Chairman, we haven't, but I respect it. And Mr. Murdoch, your wife has a very good left hook.
Mr. Murdoch, I know you did ask if you could make a closing statement, and the committee would be entirely content for you to do so.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And members of the committee, I would just like to read a short statement now. My son and I came here with great respect for all of you, for Parliament and for the people of Britain whom you represent. This is the most humble day of my career, and all that has happened, I know we needed to be here today. James and I would like to say how sorry we are for what has happened, especially with regard to listening to the voicemail of victims of crime. My company has 52,000 employees. I have led it for 57 years, and I have made my share of mistakes. I have lived in many countries, employed thousands of honest and hard-working journalists, owned nearly 200 newspapers, and forward of very different sizes, and followed countless stories about people and families around the world. At no time do I remember being as sickened as when I heard what the Dowler family had to endure, which I think was last Monday week. Nor do I recall being as angry as when I was told that the news of the world could have compounded their distress. I want to thank the Dowlers for graciously giving me the opportunity to apologise in person. I would like all the victims of phone hacking to know how completely and deeply sorry I am. Apologising cannot take back what has happened. Still, I want them to know the depth of my regret for the horrible invasions into their lives. I fully understand their ire, and I intend to work tirelessly to merit their forgiveness. I understand our responsibility to cooperate with today's session as well as with future inquiries. We now know that things went badly wrong at the News of the World. For a newspaper that held others to account, it failed when it came to itself. The behaviour that occurred went against everything that I stand for, and my son too. And it not only betrayed our readers and me, but also the many thousands of magnificent professionals in other divisions of our company around the world. So let me be clear in saying, invading people's privacy by listening to their voicemail is wrong. Paying police officers for information is wrong. They are inconsistent with our codes of conduct, and neither has any place in any part of the company that I run. But saying sorry is not enough. Things must be put right. No excuses. This is why News International is cooperating fully with the police, whose job it is to see that justice is done. It is our duty not to prejudice the outcome of the legal process. I'm sure the committee will understand this. I wish we had managed to see and fully solve these problems much earlier. When 2 men were sent to prison in 2007, I thought this matter had been settled. The police ended their investigations, and I was told that News International conducted an internal review. I am confident that when James later rejoined News Corporation, he thought the case had closed too. These are subjects you will no doubt wish to explore and have explored today. This country has given me, our companies and our employees many opportunities. I'm grateful for them. I hope our contributions to Britain will one day also be recognised. Above all, I hope that we will come to understand the wrongs of the past and prevent them from happening again, and in the years ahead, restore the nation's trust in our company and in all British journalism. I'm committed to doing everything in my power to make this happen. Thank you.
Thank you. Can I, on behalf of the committee, thank you for giving up so much of your time this afternoon to come here, and I would like to apologise again for the wholly unacceptable treatment that you received from a member of the public.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, all of you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, all members.
5 minutes.
Yeah, we will. The committee will now have a break for 5 minutes before we move to the next part. We now come to the second part of our session, and I would like to welcome Mrs. Rebekah Brooks, until recently the Chief Executive Officer of News International, and I would like to thank you for your willingness to come before the committee. We are very much aware that there is an ongoing police investigation which could lead to criminal proceedings, and we will bear that in mind, but we also appreciate your statement when you resigned from the company that you wanted to be as helpful as possible to the various inquiries that are underway. Could I just start then? News International issued a statement when you were Chief Executive in July 2009 saying there is not and never has been evidence to support allegations that News and World journalists have accessed the voicemails of any individual, that they have instructed private investigators or other third parties to access the voicemails of any individuals, or that there was systemic corporate illegality by News International. Would you accept now that that is not correct?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Firstly, just before I answer that question, I would like to add my own personal apologies to the apologies that James and Rupert Murdoch have made today. Clearly, what happened at the News of the World, and certainly when the allegations of voicemail intercepts of victims of crime is pretty horrific and abhorrent. So I just wanted to reiterate that. I also was very keen to come here and answer questions today. As you know, I was arrested and interviewed by the police a couple of days ago, so I have legal representation here just so I don't impede those criminal proceedings, which you would expect. But I intend to answer everything as openly as I can and not use that if at all possible. And I know you've all had a briefing around the same.
Well, we are grateful for that. So perhaps I can invite you to comment on whether or not you now accept the statement issued saying that News of the World journalists had not accessed voicemails or indeed instructed investigators to do so is actually untrue.
Well, again, as you've heard in the last few hours, the fact is that since the Sienna Miller civil documents came into our possession the end of December 2010, that was the first time that we, at the senior management of the company at the time, had actually seen some documentary evidence actually relating to a current employee. I think that we acted quickly and decisively then when we had that information. As you know, it was our evidence that opened up the police inquiry in 2011 in January, and since then we have admitted liability on the civil cases, endeavoured to settle as many as possible. We've appointed Sir Charles Gray so that victims of phone hacking, if they feel they want to come directly to us and don't want to incur expensive legal costs, they can come directly and be dealt with very swiftly. As you know, the court process is taking its time, and those cases aren't going to be heard until, I think, January 2012, so the compensation scheme is there in order for people to come forward. So of course there were mistakes made in the past, but I think and I hope that you will agree, since we saw the evidence at the end of December, we've acted properly and quickly.
So until you saw the evidence which was produced in the Sienna Miller case, you continued to believe that the only person in the News of the World who had been implicated in phone hacking was Clive Goodman?
Well, I think if just the sequence of events. So in 2009, I think was the first time that all of us, and I know some members of the committee have spent a long time on this story and looking at the whole sequence of events, so I know you all know it pretty well. But just to reiterate, in 2009, when we heard about when the Gordon Taylor story appeared in The Guardian, I think that's when information unravelled, but very, very slowly. I mean, we had conducted many internal investigations. I know you spent a lot of time talking to James and Rupert Murdoch about them, but we had been told by people at the News of the World at the time, had consistently denied any of these allegations in various internal investigations, and it was only when we saw the Sienna Miller documentation that we realised that of the severity of the situation. And just to point out, one of the problems of this case has been our lack of visibility on what was seized by Glenn Mulcair's home. We've had zero visibility. Part of the drip effect of this is because we only see it during a civil procedure, and then we act on that accordingly.
But it is now your view, based on that evidence, that certainly you were lied to by senior employees.
Well, I think, unfortunately, because of the criminal procedure, I'm not sure that it's possible for me to infer guilt until those criminal procedures have taken place.
Understand. Tom Watson.
There are many questions I would like to ask you, but I won't be able to do it today because you are facing criminal proceedings, so I'm going to be narrow in my questioning. Why did you sack Tom Crone?
We didn't sack Tom Crone. What happened with Tom Crone was when we made the very regrettable decision to close the News of the World after 168 years, Tom Crone has predominantly been the News of the World lawyer. His status as NI legal manager, because of the situation at the News of the World, he predominantly spent most of his time, in fact, pretty much 99% of his time on the News of the World. The rest of the company and the rest of the titles had we had appointed new lawyers, and there wasn't a job for Tom once we closed the News of the World, and he left.
Someone's still dealing with the News of the World legal cases, though.
What, sorry?
Someone is still dealing with the News of the World legal cases, though, presumably.
Yeah, I mean, the civil cases are being dealt with by, like I said, the first one is the Standards and Management Committee that we've set up. And you've seen the announcements on that recently, and I won't go over it. I know James and Rupert have talked about it. But also Farrers, who've been doing the civil cases all along. We've got some test cases coming up before the judge in January, and there are people dealing with it. But Tom Crone's role was as a hands-on legal manager of the News of the World, and obviously when we closed the paper, there wasn't a job there.
I must have misunderstood what James Murdoch said. He implied that you'd sacked him, but I might be. It's been a busy day. As a journalist and editor of News of the World and The Sun, how extensively did you work with private detectives?
I think on the Sun, not at all. When I was editor of the News of the World, as you know, I came before this committee just as I became editor of The Sun, in relation to what price privacy and Operation Motorman, as it's called. And I think back then we answered extensively questions about the use of private detectives across Fleet Street. As you know, a chart was published of which I can't remember where the News of the World was on it. I think it was fourth. I think The Sun on the table was below Take a Break magazine. But there's certainly in the top five was the Observer, the Guardian, the News of the World, the Daily Mail.
So to answer my question,
Chairman, can I just interrupt there? And I'll declare I used to work for the Observer, but left in 2001. The Observer was not at the top in the top four.
It's irrelevant.
Maybe top six then, perhaps.
And the Observer had 4 instances.
So
but it was on the table.
Just to answer my question, you extensively work with private investigators. Is that the answer?
No, what I said was that the use of private detectives in the late 90s and 2000 was a practice of Fleet Street, and after Operation Motorman and What Price Privacy, Fleet Street actually reviewed this practice, and in the main the use of private detectives was stopped. Don't forget, at the time, as you were aware, it was all about the data protection. Data Protection Acts and changes to that which were made, and that's why we had the committee in 2003.
So just for the third time, how extensively did you work with private detectives?
The News of the World employed private detectives like most newspapers in Fleet Street.
So it's fair to say that you were aware of and approved payments to private detectives?
I was aware the News of the World used private detectives under my editorship of the News of the World, yes.
And so you would have approved payments to them?
That's not how it works, but I was aware that we use them.
Who would have approved the payments?
So the payment system in a newspaper, which has been discussed at length, is very simply the editor's job is to acquire the overall budget for the paper from the senior management. Once that budget is acquired, it is given to the managing editor to allocate to different departments. Each person in that department has a different level of authorisation, but the final payments are authorised by the managing editor, unless there is a particularly big item, a set of photographs or something that needs to be discussed on a wider level, and then the editor will be brought in. So
Stuart Kuttner would have discussed some payments to private detectives with you?
Not necessarily, no. I mean, we're talking 11 years ago. He may have discussed payments to me, but I don't particularly remember any incidents.
You don't remember whether you would have discussed any payments at all?
No, I didn't say that. I said in relation to private detectives, I was aware the News of the World used private detectives, as every paper in Fleet Street did.
So you don't recall whether you authorised payments or at all with Stuart Cutler?
The payments of private detectives would have gone through the managing editor's office.
You can't remember whether Cutler ever discussed it with you?
What, sorry?
You can't remember whether Stuart Cutler ever discussed it with you?
I can't remember if we ever discussed an individual payment. No.
Okay. In your letter to us in 2009, you said that you did not recall meeting Glenmore Care. You'll appreciate that this is an inadequate answer under the circumstances. We require a specific response to our questions. Did you ever have any contact, directly or through others, with Glenmore Care?
None whatsoever.
Would your former diary secretary, Michelle, be able to confirm that?
Michelle?
Former diary secretary?
I've had a PA for 19 years called Cheryl.
Okay. Well, would your diary secretary, your PA, would be able to confirm?
Absolutely.
Does she hold your diary for the last 19 years?
No, she probably doesn't. We don't keep back 19 years, but she will. She may have something back from then. I don't know.
Would it be on a paper format or an electronic format?
Well, look, I never met. I did not meet Mr. Mulcair.
I'm talking about your diary. Is it on an electronic format or a paper format?
It would have been on a paper format until very recently.
Okay. But do you think Glenn Mulcair would deny that he ever met you?
I'm sure he would. Although, yes, it's the truth.
Okay. Were you aware of the arrangement News Group newspapers had with Mulcair whilst you were editor of News of the World and the Sun?
No.
So you didn't know what he did?
I didn't know particularly Glenn Mulcair was one of the detectives that was used by the News of the World, no.
You didn't know he was on the payroll?
No. In fact, I first heard Glenn Mulcair's name in 2006.
Did you receive any information that originated from Glenn Mulcair or his methods?
What, to me?
You?
To me personally?
You as editor. Did anyone bring you information as a result of Glenn Mulcair's methods?
I mean, look, I know it's an entirely appropriate question, but I can only keep saying the same answer. I didn't know Glenn Mulcair I'd never heard the name until 2006. There were other private investigators that I did know about and had heard about, but he wasn't one of them.
We'll come on to them. Now that you know what you know, do you suspect that you might have received information on the basis of stuff gathered by Glenn Mulcair?
Well, now I know what I know this is one of the difficulties. Obviously, I know quite an extensive amount now, particularly the last 6 months of investigating this story. And Glenn Mulcair, I am aware, worked on and off for the News of the World, I think, in the late 90s. And continued through until 2006 when he was arrested. So obviously, if he worked for the News of the World for that time, he was involved. And I think the judge said in 2007, which again we may disagree with that now, but the judge said in 2007 when Glenn Mulcair was convicted that he had a perfectly legitimate contract with the News of the World for research and investigative work, and the judge said that, I think, quite repeatedly throughout the trial. So that's what I can tell you.
Did you ever have any contact directly or through others with Jonathan Rees?
No.
Do you know about Jonathan Rees?
I do. Again, I heard a lot recently about Jonathan Rees. I watched the Panorama programme, as we all did. He wasn't a name familiar with me. I am told that he rejoined the News of the World in 2005, 2006, and he worked for the News of the World and many other newspapers in the late 1990s. That's my information.
Do you find it peculiar that, having served a sentence for a serious criminal offence, he was then rehired by the paper?
It does seem extraordinary.
Do you know who hired him?
No, I don't.
Do you know who signed his contract?
No, sorry.
Have you been conducting an investigation for 6 months? Did you not take the time to find out?
The investigation that we've been conducting in the 6 months is been particularly around the interception of voicemails, as you know. The Managements and Standards Committee at News International are going to look at Jonathan Rees, and we already do have some information, but as to the conclusion of that investigation, I do not know.
What information do you have?
we have information that, as I said, that Jonathan Rees worked for newspapers, many newspapers in Fleet Street in the late 90s, and then he was rehired in the by the News of the World sometime in 2005.
Do you know what he was doing at that time?
In
2005-06.
I don't, I'm sorry, no.
Did you not ask?
Well, I was the editor of The Sun at the time. I didn't know they'd rehired him. I've only found that out recently.
When you were chief executive of the company, did you not wonder what he did in 2005-06, given that you've got a hacking scandal breaking around you?
Absolutely, and I've had the information that Panorama have, that Jonathan Rees worked as a private investigator. In the Panorama programme, it said that he was conducting many illegal offences. That's what I saw, like you did. But also, he used to work for Panorama. He worked for many newspapers, presumably before his conviction, as you say, and then he was rehired by the News of the World.
Do you believe he conducted illegal activities on behalf of News of the World?
I can only comment what I know, and I don't know that.
What is your belief?
I don't know.
You don't know what he did?
I don't know what he did for the News of the World. I'm sorry. I don't know what he did.
Do you not think people will just find it incredible that as chief executive of the company you don't know?
Well, it may be incredible, but again, it is also the truth. I heard about Jonathan Rees's rehiring by the News of the World by an investigation conducted by Panorama.
Did you ever have any contact directly or through others with Steve Whittemore?
Yes.
What did you do with him?
Steve Whittemore was one of the private detectives, as I said, who formed, I think, the major part of Operation Motorman. And as Mr. Farrelly said...
what Steve Whittemore did, I'd like to know what you did with him.
What, sorry?
I'd like to know what you did with him.
Well, I think in the main, my use of private investigators while I was editor of the News of the World was purely legitimate and in pursuit in the main, as you know, for the addresses and whereabouts of convicted paedophiles through Sarah's Law, and that is my majority use, if not more, almost exclusively use of private investigators myself. But I respect that the News of the World also use private investigators for other stories.
Are you aware that Steve Whittemore conducted 2 ex-directory lookups on the Dowler family in Waltham-on-Thames?
I wasn't aware of that until 2 weeks ago.
You are now?
Yes, I am.
And why did you hold a mobile conversion from Steve Whittemore?
Look, as I said, it was 11 years ago. I've answered this question many times, but just to repeat, a mobile conversion, which is finding an address from a mobile phone, that is what a mobile conversion is, and can be got through legitimate means. In fact, the story that you're referring to, the mobile phone was a business number, and the address was widely known.
So you can remember what the story was then?
I've just said to you,
what was the story you were working on?
I read it because I read it in the New York Times.
Was that a paedophile you were after then?
Well, I think it'd be unfair to the person concerned because he's been named by The Guardian and the New York Times. But what I'm saying is that when I use, the very few occasions in which I use private detectives was on Sarah's Law.
Can you name other private detectives you worked with?
No.
You can't remember them?
No.
Are you aware of that the paper used other detectives, though?
What, sorry?
Did the paper use other private detectives other than Steve Whittemore, Jonathan Rees and Glenn Mulcair?
He was the one I was aware of at the time. As I said, the first time I heard about Glenn Mulcair was when he was arrested in 2006.
Is it your belief that the paper used other private investigators that you just can't remember today? No,
I remember. It isn't that I can't remember. It's you have the same information as I have, which is from Operation Motorman.
Vaguely pointless. One last question. Do you have any regrets?
Well, of course, I have regrets. I mean, the idea that Millie Dowler's phone was accessed by someone being paid by the News of the World, or even worse, authorised by someone at the News of the World, is as abhorrent to me as it is to everyone in this room. And it is ultimate regret that the speed in which we have found out and tried to find out the bottom of these investigations has been too slow. I think James and Rupert both accepted that earlier. and we are endeavouring, well, they are endeavouring now, I've left the company, to continue to investigate. But of course there are regrets.
Thank you. Louise May.
To draw you out on a question I put to Mr. James Murdoch at the end of our last session, which is on the wider culture of hacking, blagging and private detectives within Fleet Street, and to what extent the News of the World felt justified in its internal culture, in those practices, because everybody was doing it, if you like. I put to him that Piers Morgan, now a celebrity anchor on CNN, said openly in his book, clearly, which was published before this whole controversy broke, that he had hacked phones. He said that he won Scoop of the Year for a story about Ulrika Johnson and Spengler and Ericsson. He actually gave a tutorial in how one accesses voicemail by punching in a set default code, and clearly, from the account that he gives, he did it routinely as editor of the Daily Mirror, and it was something that happened at the Daily Mirror. He was also, of course, an ex-employee of News International. We've been talking about Operation Motorman and the different amounts of use that was made of Steve Whitmore by various members of Fleet Street. And I went through the Information Commissioner's report and I added them up. For transactions in the Daily Mail's Associated Newspapers group, there were 1,387 transactions with Mr. Whitmore used by 98 journalists in total across titles and supplements in that group. Is it not obviously the case then that blagging, hacking, the use of private investigators for licit and illicit purposes was an absolute culture of Fleet Street, and that the News of the World participated in its illegal activities maybe with a sense of entitlement, the same entitlement that Mr. Morgan shows in his book, because everybody else was doing it? Is that not the case?
I think it. Look, we've heard a lot over the last 10 years, but particularly I think this committee held an inquiry into Operation Motorman, which was incredibly extensive. Every single editor of Fleet Street, I think, was called to this committee, and as far as I was concerned, the failings of all newspapers in not understanding the extent of the use of private investigators across Fleet Street was held to account then, and there were many changes because of Operation Motorman to the Data Protection Act. And although I accept Mr. Farrelly's knowledge of the Observer, it's going to be far better than mine, but they in fact wrote a very good editorial on this, I think about 3 months ago, sort of readdressing that climate then and how different it is now.
The committee in 2003 concluded that there was widespread evidence of despicable practices across the media, including blagging and including payments to the police. I appreciate the legal sensitivities involved in this question, but I will put it to you anyway. In your evidence to this committee in 2003, you were asked if you have paid the police, and you clearly said, we have paid the police in the past. And if I may suggest to you that the manner in which you said that, you said it almost as though we have paid the police in the past, the implication being as do all tabloid newspapers. I'm not asking you to make specific allegations. In your general knowledge, were payments to the police widespread across Fleet Street, or were they confined to News International titles?
And if you remember the evidence that I gave in 2003, that it was actually, I was going on to explain my comment, and as you know, Mr. Bryant was asking me to explain my comment, and the actual session ended. In 2003, straight after my comment about payment to police was in fact clarified. I think Les Hinton, who was the chairman at News International at the 2007 inquiry, clarified it again, and I clarified it recently to the Home Affairs Committee at the end of March, I think. Now, I can say that I have never paid a policeman myself. I've never sanctioned or knowingly sanctioned a payment to a police officer. I was referring, if you saw at the time of the Home Affairs Select Committee recently, that you'd have various crime editors from Fleet Street discussing that in the past payments have been made to police officers. I was referring to that wide-held belief, not widespread practice. And in fact, in my experience of dealing with the police, the information they give to newspapers comes free of charge.
Mr. Dacre, in evidence to a parliamentary committee yesterday, stated that, to his knowledge, the Daily Mail has never published a story based on hacking or blagging. This from a group that Operation Motorman identified paying 1,387 transactions across its titles. Do you think it is credible that all those 1,300 plus transactions were licitly obtained? Or is there this wider culture of hacking and blagging of which your paper was a part?
Well, I didn't see Mr. Dacre's evidence. I think that you'll have seen that out of all the media groups in this country, that News International has been the one to openly welcome the Prime Minister's public inquiry into, I think, which will be all Fleet Street practices. I mean, we haven't got the parameters yet. The fact is, I'm not here in a position to comment on other newspaper groups. Like I said at the beginning, things went badly wrong at the News of the World, and we are doing our best now to sort it out. And I accept with not the speed that this committee would have wished, and mistakes have been made, but we are trying to put them right. I think on Operation Motorman it is important that there was a select inquiry into it, select committee inquiry, and it is properly right that the Code of Conduct of Journalists and the ethics of journalism are in constant review, because if they're not, it is the freedoms that this press enjoys, which I believe in very strongly. If there is not constant review of conduct and ethics, then they are at risk.
Okay, one final question. Your correspondence with the committee did place great emphasis when you were refusing to attend in previous letters on you being willing to attend as part of a panel of newspaper editors, all of whom had been identified by Operation Motorman. In other words, you appeared to put emphasis that whatever had happened at the News of the World, it was part of this wider culture. And I would just put it to you that if you seem to know or imply that these practices were going on elsewhere, how could you not be aware that they were going on endemically at the News of the World? And do you not regret that you did not yourself undertake some kind of root and branch investigation into the News of the World rather than waiting for these things to drip out over the fullness of time?
I think just going back to 2002, 2003, with all the changes to the Data Protection Act, the fact is there was a root and branch change as a result of the Select Committee inquiries and the result of the information officers' report into what price privacy. There was a fundamental change then across most newspapers, and particularly, like I said, I was then editor of The Sun, and I can say absolutely that the Sun is a very clean ship, a great newsroom, and in particular the Operation Motorman referred to the News of the World, and the Sun wasn't part of it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Jim Sheridan.
Thanks, Chair. Ms Brooks, Rupert Murdoch in his evidence session said quite clearly that the responsibility for the closure of News of the World lay fairly and squarely with senior management of that paper, which I assume would include you. Is that the case? I may have missed that part of the evidence, but I think Mr Murdoch said it exactly how it was, that it was a collective decision. We all talked together. Mr Murdoch was abroad at the time at a conference, so we all talked together, and it was. Is that Mr Murdoch Senior? Sorry, yes, Mr Murdoch, Rupert Murdoch, yes. Oh, sorry, I thought you were going to say something else. No, sorry. Just to follow up from that, when you were advising your staff that if the paper was closing during the private session, I think you said something like there was more to come. Would you like to expand on what you meant by that? It's what I said. When I went down to the newsroom to explain the decision, clearly and quite rightly, the journalists on the News of the World, who very honourable journalists who've been putting out a newspaper under this scrutiny for a long time and with great exclusives
great pride in their newspaper were very sad and baffled by management's decision to close the paper. What I was saying to them is that right now you may not be able to, right in this moment, understand why we've done it, but as the months, and I think I said in a year's time, I think you will come to a realisation that we actually did the right thing. Once you have broken the trust with the readers, there's not much going back. And unfortunately, the News of the World used to lead the headlines for the right reasons, for its the cricket scandal recently. But for the last few months, and probably actually for the last few years, it has been leading the headlines for the wrong reasons. And once that trust was broken, we felt that was the right decision. Of course, it wasn't the right decision for the hundreds of journalists who worked on there who had done nothing wrong, were in no way responsible, many of whom were at the News of the World, many of these have spent years at the News of the World, but are not culpable for anything. And we have endeavoured to find a job for every single one of them that will be offered a job.
I accept that, but it just wasn't journalists, was it? There was secretaries, engineers, rail drivers, whatever it may be, exactly. All of them. Are they all expected to find jobs?
Everybody.
As well?
Everybody.
Thank you. But,
not just in News International, but across News Corporation.
So what do you anticipate will happen in a year that you don't know now?
Well, as I've said, part of the problem with this story is the lack of visibility of the documentation seized from Glenn Moncare's house in 2006. We have no visibility on it. You have no visibility on it. Only the police have visibility on it, and they are conducting their new inquiry. And I'm sure that they will go through the thousands and thousands of documents that they say are there. And I think we will, in a year's time, maybe even longer, we will actually get to a final position on what exactly happened.
Can I ask you just a couple of questions? You'll be aware of Tommy Sheridan, the former MSP, who's now...
Yes, I
am. Can I put a question to you that unfortunately James Murdoch couldn't answer? And that is that Bob Bird, during the course of last year's Sheridan trial, gave evidence under oath on 2 occasions that emails relating to his case showing contact between the News of the World and Crown witnesses, private detectives, surveillance, phone hacking could not be retrieved as they were lost in some black hole in Mumbai. Mm-hmm. That's not the case. They've now been found, I'm told. Do you know anything about that?
No, I think actually what happened, he was referring to an issue that we'd had with our suppliers, and I think I'm correct in thinking the Information Commissioner has actually put out a clarification to that and explained that there was no issue and that they were entirely comfortable with News International's response to that.
So do you know who gave them that advice that the emails were lost?
I don't know.
Also, his defence team has still not received these retrieved emails. Have you any idea why?
What, sorry?
These emails that have since been retrieved, Tommy Sheridan's defence team still haven't received them. Any reason why?
I think actually the clarification from the Information Commissioner was in fact that what had happened was the editor of the Scottish News of the World had made a comment during the trial which had been interpreted as you are saying now, but actually when he'd looked into it and asked News International for an explanation, it was actually a problem with our suppliers in India, and there was no such retrieval.
Have you had any contact with Andy Coulson during the Sheridan case?
During the Sheridan case, I think Andy Coulson was in Downing Street during the Sheridan case, so I would have had some contact.
So there was no direct contact, no emails or letters or?
No, so I said I would have had contact.
Yeah, but there were no emails, just a conversation?
It would have been mainly to do with work, and by email or by telephone.
Just a couple of final questions. Why were the News of the World, why were you paying Andy Coulson's legal fees and Glenn Mulcairn's legal fees during the Sheridan case when they're only cited as witnesses?
So as I understand it, I know James Murdoch addressed this. When Andy Coulson left the News of the World, that he had an agreement that all matters relating to this, his legal fees were paid, and I think the same for Clive Goodman. on Glenmore Care, I think it was when his legal fees would be paid when in fact he was a co-defendant in the civil cases.
Okay, and just finally, are you aware of any payment to police officers in East Lothian Force?
No.
Edinburgh Force?
No.
Okay, thanks, Chairman.
Damien Collins.
Thank you, Chairman. I'd like to ask some questions about the Millie Dowler case in particular. Just for the record, Ms. Brooks, you were editor of the News of the World during the period of Millie Dowler's abduction and her subsequent murder. Just could you, I've got some specific questions I'd like to ask you about this, but could you just paint a picture for us about how a newspaper like the News of the World goes about reporting on such a big story, what the level of the editor, deputy editor, the senior reporters would be in putting together and overseeing a story like that?
I think any big story, but for the purpose of process, most stories start out with the reporter, and that reporter may be being asked by the news editor to go and investigate a story, or they may have brought information about a story from their own contacts to the news editor. It is at that stage in a newspaper where the reporter and news editor discuss the veracity of the information, go out and check the allegations, and come back with a more considered view. You can imagine that every newspaper gets a lot of information to the news desk, and only a percentage, very small percentage, makes it actually to publication. So there are many layers, from reporter to assistant news editor to news editor. Finally, the story will go to the backbench, which will be the people that will oversee the subbing of that story, and the sub will often talk to the reporter directly with questions and amendments to the copy. The lawyers are involved at this stage throughout the process, and then finally the final decision on publication will be made by the editor, where it is and how prominent it was. Obviously, Millie Dowler's disappearance was a terrible news story, and it would have been covered by all newspapers, and for a very long time. The trial only finished last month.
But for something like this, would it be normal to expect that it would have been the editor or the most senior member of the editorial staff on duty that day, the lawyers who would sign off on anything that we've written about it because of the incredible sensitivity of the material?
Well, that is probably true. Yes, that on any story, but particularly, as you say, on such a sensitive story, the lawyers will be heavily involved, and talking to the reporters and to the news editors, or the news editors or the executives on the news desk, as to where the information came from or what the veracity of that information.
And how involved were you personally in the Millie Dowler case as editor of the News of the World?
Well, as I say, the story ran for a very, very long time, and so I will have been involved in the story over the many years. I mean, even when I was editor of The Sun, you know, the Millie Dowler investigation and the pursuit of justice for Millie Dowler has been in the news for many, many years, 9 years. But
focusing on the time at the News of the World was obviously particularly pertinent to our hearing today. Would you say that the Millie Dowler case was a story that you were more heavily involved with than other stories that took place during your editorship, simply because of the magnitude of the events and people's sort of real shock and horror at what had happened?
Not particularly more or less involved. The one thing I would say that we had a series under my editorship, a series of terrible and tragic news stories, starting with Sarah Payne, Millie Dowler's disappearance and subsequent murder, and then of course the Soham cases. And as you know, part of my main focus of my editorship of the News of the World was in convincing Parliament that there needed to be radical changes to the 1997 Sex Offenders Act, which became known as Sarah's Law, which was very similar to laws imposed in America under Meghan's law. So I suppose that if I had a particular extra involvement in any of those stories, it would have been on the basis that I was trying to push and campaign for readers' rights versus on the issue, on the 10 pieces of legislation that we got through on Sarah's Law, and just campaigning for those to be put forward.
When you give evidence to the committee in 2003, you referenced the Millie Dowler case as an example of how you thought the press had worked particularly well with the police and the family liaison officers, and it was a view that was supported by Andy Coulson, who gave evidence with you on that day. I know, appreciate this is quite a long time ago. Is that something you stand by now? And did you have you spoke about it when you gave evidence. Did you have a particular knowledge of the details of the case?
When I spoke about it in 2003, I was unaware of what I now know. However, in 2003, as far as I was concerned, which may sound, in light of what we believe the allegations are now, it may sound quite frankly ridiculous, but at the time I believed that both on the Millie Dowler case and in the Sohn cases that the press had exercised huge caution and tried to respect the privacy of families. For example, I remember in Soham that one member of press association was sent to go to the village and meet, and I was referring to that Fleet Street had actually come together and used the Press Complaints Commission code and adhered to it to respect the privacy of the families. Clearly, these allegations that came out 2 weeks ago, if true, are appalling and obviously contradict that statement I made.
And, well, as you say, I mean, in the context of what we now know, it does appear ridiculous, to use your word. When were you first aware that Millie Dowler's phone had been hacked?
I think it was last Monday. No, maybe the Monday before.
That was the first knowledge you had of it.
I heard of it when the story first broke in the media, I think, on Monday evening.
But no, nothing had been said to you, News of the World, to suggest that Millie Dowler's phone had been hacked and that they had been carried out or authorised by an employee of the News of the World?
Of course not, no.
And when were you aware that that people at the News of the World may have gave this information to the police, information about what was on Millie Dowler's phone to support their investigation?
Well, at the moment, and I want to be I'm going to have to be slightly careful, but I want to be as open as possible. We saw the story at the same time that you all saw the story. My instant reaction, like everybody else, was one of shock and disgust that a family who had suffered so much already had these allegations that were clearly added immeasurably to their suffering. The first thing I did was write to Mr. and Mrs. Dowler with a full apology to say that we would get to the bottom of the allegations, and if anyone, either representing the News of the World or authorised by a professional journalist at the News of the World, which I still find staggering to believe, but if we find out that is true, and I have every confidence that News International and the police will get to the bottom of that, and they should, as a priority.
I appreciate your statement there, but what I asked was about when you were aware that information that was passed to the Surrey police that resulted from the hacking of Millie Dowler's phone. And are you saying you weren't aware of that until it was reported recently in the newspapers?
Yes.
If it is the case that employees of the News of the World were firstly sanctioned the hacking of Millie Dowler's phone, potentially deleted emails from it, knew that and withheld that information from you, and then decided of their own volition to pass that information on to the police, and if that is what you're asking us to believe, am I right in saying that?
So can you explain about passing it on to the police?
Yes, if information that was received, if information held by employees of the News of the World relating to information that was relating to the hacking of Millie Dowler's phone was passed to the police to support their investigation. You said the first you knew about that was on when you read that, when it was reported in the newspapers.
Yes.
But what I'm saying is it must be the case, therefore, that someone without your knowledge, who was an employee of yours at the News of the World, decided without consulting the editor or maybe who they did consult to pass that on to the police. And is that from your position? Is that the case? Is that the chain of events as they must have existed?
But I think I understand the question. I think it's important to say that obviously the Millie Dowler news story went on for many years, and I had been editor of both the News of the World and the Sun while that investigation was ongoing. What you asked me, and I thought you were referring to, was when did I first hear an allegation that Millie Dowler's phone or voicemails had been intercepted by either someone working for the News of the World or authorised by someone at the News of the World. And the first time I'd ever heard that was 2 weeks ago.
Right. But with regard to information being passed to the police about the hacking of the phone?
Well, I wrote to Surrey Police immediately. My first port of call was to send Millie Dowler's family an unreserved apology on behalf of the News International and to assure them that we would get to the bottom of it. Representatives then met with the Millie Dowler family lawyer almost immediately to try and get some more information to see if there was anything we could do, look for or assist in this case. And the third thing I did was write to Surrey Police to say that obviously in the last 9 years, if they had come across any information that supported these allegations, could they please either give it to the Metropolitan Police's inquiry or share it with the Management and Standards Committee at News International. I had a response from Surrey Police at the end of last week, which is that because it was part of a criminal investigation, they couldn't help me.
One of the points I'm trying to get to is that it would seem, I think, to us incredible that potentially, allegedly, someone, an employee of the News of the World, would take the decision themselves to pass information on to the police relating to that they held that, however obtained, was the result of a newspaper investigation that they were part of, and that they didn't consult the editor, didn't consult senior members of staff there. That seemed incredible.
But is your allegation is that someone on the News of the World knew that they had themselves or authorised someone to access the voicemails of Millie Dowler, and that they then told the police that they had accessed Millie Dowler's phone and they passed on that information? Is that the allegation?
Well, what I'm saying is there a chain of events which links the hacking of the phone, allegedly by someone at the News of the World or authorised by the News of the World, to the passing to the police of information regarding what was on Millie Dowler's phone, and also, obviously, we've now subsequently heard about the deletion of messages. That was what I was asking about.
Well, on the allegations of either someone from the News of the World or someone authorised on the News of the World had access the voicemails of Millie Dowler is an allegation, an incredibly serious allegation, and one that appalls us all, and that is being investigated right now. And that when I first heard of it was 2 weeks ago. Sorry, that's just how it is.
It just seems, I think, incredible that you, as the editor, were so unaware of such fundamental issues to do with this investigation. In some ways, I think the opposite. I don't know anyone in their right mind who would authorise, know, sanction, approve of anyone listening to the voicemails of Millie Dowler in those circumstances. I just don't know anyone who would think it was a right and proper thing to do at this time or at any time. And I know we know a lot more now, but that's all I can tell you. Because this is potentially something that happened under your watch as editor. If it is proven that this was the case, would you take personal responsibility for what happened under your editorship of the newspaper?
Well, I would take responsibility, absolutely. And I really, really do want to understand what happened. I think all of us do, because that, out of everything that I've heard of this case, I think that was probably the most shocking thing I'd heard for a long time, and certainly the most shocking thing I'd heard about potential journalists who work for News International.
Thank you. Paul Farrelly.
Thank you, Chair. I've just got a couple of questions that have still been left hanging in the air about Millie Dowler. But first of all, I just wanted to clarify one bit of curiosity. That I still have from Tom's questions. I was at the Observer before 2001 when I was elected, so it wasn't at the time covered by Motorman, so I can't speak for the Observer. One thing I do know that's not changed is there's no publicly issued list directory of mobile phone numbers. So, from your evidence that there are ways of converting mobile numbers to addresses by legal means, including web search, the person would actually have to put their number on the internet, or otherwise otherwise, if the private investigator had secured it from a mobile phone company or through the police, you'd have to have a public interest defence for doing so. So can you remember whether you got a public interest defence if you were challenged?
Like I said, I felt, and many people disagreed with the campaign, but I felt that Sarah's Law and the woeful 1997 Offenders Act that needed to be changed to protect the public, I felt was absolutely in the public interest. However, on that particular case, and don't forget, I only remembered it when I was represented with it. In that particular case, I know at the time my use of private detectives was around Sarah's Law. That was my own personal.
No, but was that particular suspected mobile line 547 of the Blue Book held by the Info Commissioner, where your Secretary Cheryl is extension 4406 as a contact point? Was that a suspected paedophile?
I can only assume it was, but as this person has been named and interviewed extensively now by the media, and has said that quite openly that he's not guilty of any wrongdoing and he can't understand why any of us were looking at him at the time, then I have to accept that. I don't think that the inquiry led to publication about him. I think, but at the time, that we use private detectives in order to track down the many convicted paedophiles that were living in the community. So
you would have had a public interest offence in that particular case. You feel it wasn't just a question of employing Steve Whittemore on a no questions asked basis?
No, absolutely not. And I think as you know, as you say, you weren't at the Observer at the time, but it wasn't, and you left in 2001. 2001. But the Observer have used private detectives before 2001. I mean, it wasn't a new practice at the Observer in 2001. In your time at the Observer, private detectives were used as they were used across Fleet Street, and I'm sure you, like I, thought they were from legitimate means. Clearly, when we had what price privacy, when we had the Select Committee inquiry, and as Louise has mentioned, the subsequent conclusion of that, it was the governance around private detectives was found to be wanting, and the industry on the back of this committee's inquiry changed their ways.
Let me move on to the connection with the link with Millie Dowler. After the arrest and conviction of Goodman and Mulcair, two myths were being peddled, and News International was at the forefront of peddling both of them. One was that it was just a rogue reporter, and secondly, that Mulcair was not really active. He wasn't doing this sort of stuff until 2005, which coincided. You'd gone by then, and also the myth really was not to make any link between the two activities, his activities and the sorts of activities that are going on in Motorman. Now, the Millie Dowler case comprehensively demolished both of those myths, didn't it?
Well, I think if you remember at the time, when Glenn Mulcair and Clive Goodman were arrested in 2006, it was the belief of News International, but on the basis it was the belief of the police, that they would be thoroughly investigating this. In fact, previous to the arrest of Glenn Mulcair and Clive Goodman, they had been investigating this situation in order to make the arrest. And so, I understand why you're using the language of myth, but for all of us then, that was the reality. We were told in the trial in 2007 that in Glenn Mulcair's pre-disclosure for sentencing, stated categorically that he didn't start accessing voicemails until 2004. It wasn't 5, it was 2004. That's what he said. That's what he told the trial. After 2007, there was committee hearings. News International conducted the internal investigation that you covered extensively in the previous session, and the police closed the inquiry. And from my own knowledge, in 2006, because my own phone, as everyone knows now, was accessed by Glenn Mulcair, my own voicemails, were accessed by Glenn Mulcair on a regular basis. I had the same knowledge that everyone else was, and whether you can say it's a myth now, clearly we have now seen evidence that that is not the case. But it wasn't a myth; it was what everyone believed at the time.
I mean, thanks to a partial leak, at least a very a good description of the paper that was left in the office, the safe of Harbottle and Lewis. We've had an account through the Sunday Times in the last few days that there were a number of gatekeepers on news desks in both Your Time and the News of the World, and under Andy Coulson. The names were Alex Runchak, Greg Miskew, Clive Goodman, Neville Thirlbeck, James Weatherup, Ian Edmondson, if the Sunday Times is accurate. And yet we're still being asked to believe that you as a hands-on editor and Andy Coulson simply didn't know what your news desk was up to.
Look, I can't comment on what others knew and when they knew it and how they knew it. I can only tell this committee what I knew while I was editor of the News of the World and subsequently editor of The Sun. And as chief executive, I can account for my actions in trying to get to the bottom of this story. And in 2006, from my own personal point of view, I was the editor of The Sun. I have been approached by the police to explain the nature of access on my own voicemails, and I reported that back to the company and was therefore ring-fenced from any of the subsequent investigations. I just remained editor of The Sun, and when I became chief executive in 2009, that is when I started to pick up much more responsibility of how we acted in getting to the bottom of this story.
Well, I'll suspend my incredulity again. Can I just move on to Millie Dowler? After the Millie Dowler story, which was the straw that broke the camel's back finally, your company, News International, on your behalf, I assume, was very quick to distance you from being anywhere on the premises at the time that particular story was run. They said, and it's been quoted in the newspapers, that you were on holiday at the time. Is that the case?
But it's slightly irrelevant where I was. I was the editor of the time. If this happened, then it's appalling. I didn't know it was happening.
Well, it's not irrelevant because they distanced you from it. They put out a statement or talked to the press. It's been reported. You were on holiday at the time.
There were no statements put out about me being away on time.
If you do the clips, you'll find it reported.
I know.
Sourced to the company.
Yes, but we didn't put. You said a statement. We didn't put out a statement. The actual fact was I was away for the story that they are talking about. But I feel as editor that is irrelevant. I was the editor of the paper. And therefore, ultimately, it happened on my watch.
And who would have been editing the paper when you were away? Your deputy?
Deputy or the associate editor?
Who was the deputy?
Well, I had a deputy, Andy Coulson, and associate editor, Harry Scott.
So Andy Coulson would have been editing it while you were
presumably,
away?
But I don't absolutely know. But yes.
I don't want to take too long. Can I turn now to you saw the exchanges over the email, the sheaf of paper that was found, that was residing for a long time in the offices of Harbottle and Lewis, that gives the lie to the evidence that we received previously about the results of a huge email trawl after Colin Myler arrived. Clearly that was still sitting there when you became the chief executive in 2009, so that was it was all commissioned before your watch, but it was sitting there on your watch. James Murdoch said he first learned about it in either April or May, and then it was passed to the police in June. When did you first learn about that evidence was there?
Just before James Murdoch, and I then went to tell him what we'd found.
Was it Will Lewis? Did he report the find to you?
Actually, what happened is, as you know, we have this management standards committee that we set up after the police reopened their investigation in January 2011. Obviously, it was our investigation that led to the opening of that inquiry. The information that we handed over to the police, they then opened it, and we subsequently set up a management standards committee in order to facilitate the police with any information they requested or anything that we could proactively find to help them. As part of that disclosure and as part of the references made to the internal investigation into Harbottle and Lewis, the police but as part of the reference, the police asked the Management and Standards Committee about the Harbottle and Lewis. We went off to look for it. We then found it. As I think James Murdoch said in his session, we took counsel about it and we handed it over to the police on June the 20th.
Right. Okay. Now, this trawl didn't just involve News of the World people, because it was overseen by News International people who reported to you as chief executive. In particular, John Chapman. Can you remember what conversations you had with John Chapman after this evidence came to light? Because we've heard from Rupert Murdoch that John Chapman, to use his words, John Chapman sat on that file for years.
Well, the original inquiry in 2007, I believe, was instructed. I think Les Hinton instructed.
Yes, we know the background. I'm just asking you about when the evidence came to light through your committee. Did you have any? And John Chapman is a News International legal director who reports to you. Mm-hmm. Can you remember what conversations you had with him?
Yes, I can. We discussed it. I mean, as soon as it came to light, I think it was in the end of April that I was told about it. That Mr. Chapman was asked for his knowledge of it, where the file had been, why it hadn't come to light before, and the Management and Standards Committee.
And what was his response to you?
His response to us at the time was that he was asked to do an investigation into the illegal interception of voicemails, that he felt that he felt that the Harbottle and Lewis recommendation, which was the letter that you have got,
very misleading letter.
But he felt, as our legal advisor, that the letter from Harbottle and Lewis was an accurate review of the Harbottle and Lewis file. That is something as clearly you've heard today that neither James Murdoch and I thought it was on closer examination.
So did he just do that off his own bat?
Do what, sorry?
Did he just clearly get Harbottle and Lewis to issue a misleading letter, or a letter that may not have been misleading to them at the time, but actually to sit on evidence that gave a lie to what we were told? Did he just do that off his own bat?
Well, Harbottle and Lewis are a very respected law firm. I'm not sure that it's fair of you to accuse them of.
I'm not. I'm asking about John Chapman, who reported to you.
John, you said that. You asked if John Chapman.
Did he take the decision not to disclose anything any further?
No, but you asked if John Chapman had asked Harbottle and Lewis.
I know. I asked you what he said to you.
Yes, but you also said, did John Chapman ask Harbottle and Lewis to write a misleading letter? And my response to that question was that I think that, firstly, that Harbottle and Lewis are a very respected legal firm, and I'm sure that that wouldn't be the case. And John Chapman had been a very respected lawyer at News International for many years, and I'm sure would absolutely not have done that. However, in light of what we know now, when I and the Management Standards Committee of News International saw that file, we felt that it, from our perspective, put a new light on information that we had in the past, and we handed it over to the police.
Yeah, well, I didn't ask that question, but it would have been a very good question to ask. So thank you. Now, why did John Chapman leave the employ of News International?
As you heard in the previous session, that John Chapman wanted to leave, and we felt that under the circumstances that that was the right course of action.
Okay, because John Chapman's come out very strongly as the fall guy from this session. He acted alone, did he?
I think at the time that John Chapman, who is a corporate lawyer, and Daniel Cloak, who was our head of HR, I think that they would say, if called to this committee, that from in their experience and their knowledge, when they looked at the file, they felt that the Harbottle and Lewis letter was correct.
Okay, I've got just a couple of final questions. One thing that struck many people was the silence across Fleet Street, apart from a few newspapers. The Guardian, of course, the Independent, and the FT, and then the New York Times, in the coverage of this affair. Can you remember calling any editors after the Guardian story in July 2005 to discuss how they might cover or not cover the story in order to downplay the coverage?
In 2005?
In 2009, after the Guardian broke the story. Do you remember calling around editors like Paul Dacre to in some way encourage them not to give the story any play?
I don't remember calling him about it, but he and I would talk about industry matters on occasion. But I only knew what I read on what I'd read on the Guardian.
Yeah. And the final question: do you recall a conversation with Boris Johnson during which he asked you what you want out of this, and your response was for Alan Rusbridger to go down on his knees and beg your forgiveness? Do you recall that conversation?
Absolutely not.
Okay, thank you.
Therese Coffey.
Can I have that? Sorry, thank you. Sorry, I had assumed my colleague Mr. Watson might ask you about this earlier, but in his intervention in the House on 6th of July, he referred to the fact that part of the News of the World, he suggested that they wrote that there was left a message on her voicemail after the 13-year-old vanished at 4 p.m. on March 21st. On March 27th, 6 days after Millie went missing in Walton-on-Thames, Surrey, the employment agency appears to have phoned her mobile. Given the importance of the Millie Dowler story and the seriousness of that, which has already been alluded to, was there not a question, did you ask a question about how you managed to get that information?
Well, as I've said, I mean, look, the most important thing I think in the Millie Dowler, in the case of Millie Dowler, is that we get to the truth of these allegations as quickly as possible. And I think that those who were culpable of that, if that turns out to be true, should face not just opprobrium, but also the correct justice through the legal system. So I'm very mindful that I have to be careful on what I say because of what I know in the criminal investigations. But the fact is, and I can only keep saying this, is that the suggestion that Millie Dowler's voicemails was intercepted by someone working for the News of the World or someone on the News of the World was unknown to me. It's abhorrent to me, and that's all I can tell you.
I accept that, and I will press a little bit further in, Mrs. Brooks. It's just trying to understand the fact that there is a specific reference in the story. So I'm just surprised that, if you like, perhaps more questions weren't asked at the time. And I fully accept that you find it abhorrent.
But just accept that perhaps 9 years ago, when the story was run, I'm told now that the story you're referring to was a single column on page 9 of the newspaper of that edition. I am sure questions were asked about where that information came from. They will have been asked of the reporter, or they will have been asked of the news editor. The night editor would have checked them, the lawyer would have checked them, and there would have been a process around every story, whether it's a single column or the front page. There would have been some sort of process around where that information came from. And I can tell you now that it would not have been the case that someone said, oh yes, that came from an illegal voicemail interception. It seems now that it's inconceivable that people didn't know this was the case, but at the time, it wasn't a practice that was condoned or sanctioned at the News of the World under my editorship. And that's all I can tell you.
Okay. Mr. Watson also went on to say, talking about, he suggests that you were present at a meeting with Scotland Yard when police officers pursuing a murder investigation provided you with evidence that your newspaper was interfering in the pursuit of justice. He particularly mentions the name of another senior executive, Alex Maranchak, and also at the meeting, which included Dick Fedorcia of Metropolitan Police, that News of the World staff were guilty of interference and parties using unlawful means to attempt to discredit a police officer and his wife. Can you tell us more about that meeting?
Well, I can tell you something about it, but it's I was asked to recall a meeting that I had at Scotland Yard in 2002. I had recollection. I was asked recently, I think by Channel 4, about the story you're referring to. My information, my recollection of that meeting was entirely different. My recollection of the meeting was on a completely different subject. So I'm only going on what I was told by Channel 4. They say it's a meeting in November that I had. That was what was put to me. I checked my diary as much as possible, and there was no meeting in November. However, there was a subsequent meeting in very early January. So it may be that it was that meeting. That was not my recollection of the meeting. Okay. But on the other hand, because of the Sarah's Law campaign, I did have some pretty regular meetings at Scotland Yard, mainly with the paedophile unit there.
Thank you. In terms of Rupert Murdoch said he relied on his lieutenants, people he trusted, referred to Les Hinton as someone with whom he would trust his life. Who would you trust? Who worked for you?
Well, I think the newsroom of any newspaper is based on trust. And if you think about and I'm sure Mr. Farrelly will agree with this, if you think about the way in which a story gets published, of course it's on trust. And so you rely on the people that work for you to behave in a proper manner, and you rely on clarity of information that you are given at the time. So that is why I can be so absolute with the committee today about the interception of Millie Dowler's voicemail from my own personal view. Again, not commenting on what other people knew at the time. So when you say who do I trust, the whole newsroom and the whole basis of the newsroom is based on trust. For example, at The Sun, if Trevor Kavanagh, who was my political editor when I was editor of The Sun, came to me with a story, I knew it to be true. I didn't need to ask which MP or which cabinet minister had leaked in the story. I just knew it to be true because of the standing that Trevor Kavanagh has and his experience as a journalist. Again, you could say that's based on trust, but that is how it works.
Mr Mulcair seems to have implicated himself in his own public statements about the Millie Dowler situation.
Yes.
Who else, from what you now know, that you didn't know before, do you believe people are likely to be convicted of crimes?
Well, again, I think that would be...
Apparently, I've just been told I can't answer that.
I was just going to say, I think that would be slightly... None of us here should be judge and jury, but I don't think we should answer that.
Many of us are called on to the observing jury. Okay. Who else now knows what you now know, who either still works at News International or has left its employ in the last month? So it seems there's been a team that's pulled together. Who could you say has done that?
So the process of the criminal investigation started when we handed over documentation that we had found. All that documentation has been shared with the Management and Standards Committee of News International that, as James and Rupert Murdoch referred to, reporting directly to the Board of News Corporation, and they're independent from News International for that particular reason. Obviously, all the legal team working on this know about it, and also the police are aware of everything that we're aware.
And just to clarify, would that group of people include anyone who's previously given evidence to our committee or predecessor committee? People like Colin Myler or Les Hinton? They're the names I can think of.
Actually, probably not. No, because the Management and Standards Committee was concerned with was about the current management. It was so it's the chief executive and my current executives would know about it.
Final question for me would be: do you have any regrets about any of the headlines that you've done? Now you've been in the spotlight yourself. You've been subject to quite a lot of media spotlight. Does this make you regret anyone at all?
I don't think you'd find any editor in Fleet Street that didn't feel that some headlines that they have published, they'd made some mistakes, and I'm no different to that. There have been mistakes. On the other hand, despite, as you say, being in the spotlight recently, and having read lots of criticism that's justified and lots of criticism that was totally spurious, that I would defend the right of a free press for my entire career. I think it's vital to us, and yes, it hasn't been particularly pleasant. It was one of the main reasons that I wanted to leave, because I felt that I was detracting from the amazing journalists and media executives and all the people that work in News International. I felt that I was detracting from their incredibly good work. But we have a very robust and diverse press in this country, covering all spectrums and all opinions, and I think the freedom of that press should be ensured forevermore. I hope that Parliament continue to do that.
Thank you. Philip Davis.
How many times would you speak to Rupert Murdoch when you were Chief Executive of News International?
I would speak to Mr. Murdoch and James Murdoch much more regularly since I've become Chief Executive than I did when I was editor.
Once a day, twice a day?
James Murdoch and I have offices next to each other, although his travel schedule, because of his wide responsibilities, and I would talk to Rupert Murdoch quite regularly.
Once a day, twice a day? Can you give me any kind of what?
On average, every other day, but pretty regularly.
Thanks. You said that everyone at News of the World was everyone was working hard to get them a job and make sure that they didn't lose it, which is perfectly admirable. Why is that not the same for Tom Crone then? I mean, you said that the reason he left the employment was because his job sort of no longer existed at the News of the World. He was doing that. So if you're busily trying to find a job for everybody at the News of the World, why is poor old Tom Crone why are you not finding a job for him? Why have you got the Spanish Archer?
There are some people that didn't want a job. In the case of Tom Crone, Tom's title was News International Legal Manager. He wasn't as Mr. Sheridan pointed out, it wasn't just journalists, and it was drivers, secretaries. There's many people to find news from the News of the World. In the case of Tom, as I explained, that he predominantly for the last few years had worked as the legal manager for the News of the World, and in fact there's legal teams on all the other newspapers. So that was the current situation with Tom.
Can I just ask you about Neville Thurlbeck? Did you know that when you were editor of News of the World, did you know that he was somebody who was an informer to the police?
No.
You didn't know that he was a police informer?
Is that true?
Well, it's in the Evening Standard, and they quoted they've quoted court reports dating back to 2000 when he said himself after a case that the police were very impressed about the type of intelligence I was coming up with that was revealed in court, and the judge said it was a substantial volume of information that was extremely useful to the police. It says also that sources close to Thurlbeck said that, and this is a quote, people right at the top of News International were aware of his role with the police.
I was not aware Neville Thurlbeck was a police informant.
So that comes as a complete shock to you?
You're telling me now, but I'm not even sure what it means particularly. I mean, if you're asking me about do members of the press and members of the police force have a symbiotic relationship of exchanging information for public interest, then they do. But I'm not quite sure what the word police informant means.
Well, the allegation is that he passed a substantial volume of information that was extremely useful to Scotland Yard, and in return Mr. Thurlbeck received dozens of items of confidential information from the police national computer. That's the allegation of the... Well, that's nothing.
I don't know about that. But most journalists who work as either a crime editor or crime correspondents have a working relationship with their particular police force.
When our report was published in early 2010, it was when you were Chief Executive of News International, and there were certain things where obviously we had reported that we found that the evidence from the people from News International was wholly unsatisfactory, the collective amnesia that we referred to in our report, that we felt it was inconceivable that Clive Goodman was a rogue reporter, as had been passed on to us, that we referred to the For Neville email in there, all of that kind of stuff. When you were chief executive of News International, when that, at the time that report was published, did you read the report that we published?
Yes, I did. I mean, I'm not saying I read every single word, but I read a large majority of it. I particularly read the criticisms that were addressed to the company, and I can only hope that from the evidence that you've heard from us today, that we have really stepped up our investigation. Rupert and James Murdoch have been here today, being very open and very honest with you as a committee. I was very willing to come despite the fact that there are some legal issues around what I say. I hope that you think that when we saw the civil disclosure in December 2010, we acted swiftly and promptly to deal with it. The police investigation would not be open now. There would be not a new criminal inquiry if it hadn't been for the information that News International handed over. And I'm not saying that we haven't made mistakes, but the Metropolitan Police have repeatedly said, as you heard last week, or the Home Affairs Committee heard last week, they repeatedly said there was no need for a further criminal investigation. So I think that everyone involved in 2007 would say now that the mistakes were made, but I hope that you feel that we've responded appropriately and responsibly since we saw the information in 2010.
So when you read the report, did that make you think, well, hold on a minute, this isn't, there are some things here that don't stack up. We might not have any evidence, I might not know anything, these people, but, there's clearly something that's not quite right here. Did that sort of prompt any activity on your part as Chief Executive of News International to say, well, let's go back over this, and because there's something not right here?
Everyone at News International has great respect for Parliament and for this committee, and of course to be criticised by your report was something that we responded to. We looked at the report, but it was only when we had the information in December 2010 that we did something from it. But, I think you heard today from Rupert Murdoch, who said that this was, the most humble day. We come before this committee to try and explain openly and honestly what happened. And of course we were very unhappy with the criticisms that this committee found against the company. We aspire daily to have a great company, and your criticisms were felt.
So, could you tell us how often you either spoke to or met the various prime ministers that there's been since you've been an editor of News of the World, News of the Sun, and chief executive of News International? How often would you speak to or meet Tony Blair, Gordon Brown, and David Cameron, respectively? On the Prime Minister David Cameron, we've met. I read the other day that we've met 26 times. I don't know if that is absolutely correct. I can, do my best to come back to you on an exact number on that. I'm sure it is correct if that's what the Prime Minister's office say. The fact is, I've never been to Downing Street while David Cameron has been Prime Minister. Yet, under Prime Minister Gordon Brown and Prime Minister Tony Blair, I did regularly go to Downing Street. How's regularly?
On Prime Minister Gordon Brown, in the time that he was in Downing Street, and while he was, and also while he was Chancellor, I would have gone maybe 6 times a year.
And with Tony Blair, something similar?
Probably similar, maybe in the last few years a little more, but I can come, if you want the exact numbers, I can do my best to get that, but strangely it was under Labour Prime Ministers that I was a regular visitor to Downing Street and not the current administration.
Do you think that there was a change of emphasis when you were either editor of The Sun or chief executive of News International? In that it always struck me when I was growing up that the Sun and the News of the World, particularly The Sun, always struck me as being a sort of a rather anti-establishment kind of publication. It was always seemed to me as the sort of paper that was sort of on the side of the little person fighting the establishment. Would you say that when you became editor, and obviously your relationship with those prime ministers, that there was a shift and actually the News International became part of the establishment as opposed to being anti-establishment?
Well, considering the amount of complaints I used to get from both prime ministers about the coverage in The Sun, I would think if they were here now they would say that that is not the case. Throughout my editorship of The Sun, as you know, one of the main campaigns that we have had is for Help for Heroes, and I think The Sun is absolutely the paper for the military, and that caused us to have very, very uncomfortable conversations, particularly with Prime Minister Gordon Brown. One of the issues that still is apparent today as it was back then is the lack of awareness of other aspects of the media and of Parliament to acknowledge that currently we have soldiers fighting in Afghanistan a war, and people don't seem to forget that. So I would not say that any Prime Minister would think The Sun was not fighting for the right people. In fact, The Sun continues to fight for the right people.
How often would any of those Prime Ministers ask you to, as either editor or chief executive at your time, how often, or would they ever ask you not to publish a story? Would they know something was coming in the news, and would they sort of ask you to spike a story? Would that happen?
I can't remember an occasion where Prime Ministers asked us to not run a story.
That's not or politicians generally. Is that something that would happen?
No, I mean I would say that I can remember many occasions when a cabinet minister or a politician or a prime minister was very unhappy at the stories we were running, but not that they'd ever pleaded directly for it not to run.
And if they had, you wouldn't have been interested anyway, presumably.
As long as the story was true and accurate or was part of our campaign, then no, there's no reason for a Prime Minister. I mean, that's exactly why we have a free press. My final question. This is my final question. There's sort of, I think, a feeling that in some way that you had a close relationship with the Prime Minister, the current Prime Minister. I think the allegation goes, it seems to me that it's no different to your relationship with previous Prime Ministers, but just for the benefit of what people may perceive, that you had a close relationship with the Prime Minister. That was helpful to him, and certainly News International support was helpful to him politically. But that in return, what News Corporation were hoping for, whether that would in some way grease the wheels to the takeover of Beast Can I Be? Was that any of that? Was any of that sort of part of the wider strategy of News Corporation? Were you encouraged to get closer to the Prime Ministers with that in mind? No, not at all. I've read many allegations about my current relationship with the Prime Minister, with David Cameron, including my extensive horse riding with him every weekend up in Oxfordshire. I mean, I have never been horse riding with the Prime Minister. I don't know where that story came from. I was asked 3 days ago to disclose the racehorse that I owned with the Prime Minister, which I do not, and I was asked a week ago to explain why I owned some land with the Prime Minister, which I do not. So I'm afraid in this current climate, many of the allegations that are putting forward that I'm trying to answer honestly, but there is a lot out there that just isn't true, and particularly around this subject of my relationship with David Cameron. The truth is that he is a neighbour and a friend, but I deem the relationship to be wholly appropriate, and at no time have I ever had any conversation with the Prime Minister that you in the room would disapprove of.
Thank you. And Adrian Sandler.
Well, on that point,
A newspaper reported the other day that you'd advised David Cameron on whom to appoint as a press spokesman and suggested it should be Andy Coulson.
Yes, I also read that.
What was your reaction to that story?
So I think it's a matter of public knowledge that it was George Osborne, the Chancellor's idea that when Andy Coulson left the News of the World, that they should start discussions with him on whether he would be an appropriate person to go into Tory HQ. The first time I heard of him being approached was from Andy Coulson and not from the Prime Minister.
So you had no conversation with David Cameron. He wasn't Prime Minister at the time.
Yeah, the answer is that the allegation which I have read is that I told the Prime Minister to hire Andy Coulson, and that is not true. Right. Never was true. Right. And the idea came from George Osborne.
So you had no conversation with David Cameron about Andy Coulson being suitable for that position?
No.
None whatsoever?
No, obviously, you were talking before his appointment.
Yeah.
No.
You presumably would, in a social context, swap gossip with David Cameron when you meet. And that gossip could actually be having been obtained by illegal means. Are you satisfied that your dealings with David Cameron before and after becoming Prime Minister, that the sort of gossip that you might share was above board?
Well, I hope my earlier assurance that in any social encounters that I've had with the Prime Minister, that any conversations were wholly appropriate, both as my position as Editor of The Sun or Chief Executive and his position as Prime Minister.
And did you approve the subsidizing of Andy Coulson's salary after he left News of the World?
Again, that's not true. So I didn't approve it.
So the New Statesman report, like the Daily Mail report, is inaccurate, that his salary is not being subsidised by News International.
That is correct. They are incorrect.
Okay.
Sorry.
I have one final, very small question from Mr. Faraday.
Thank you, John. Would you agree, Mr. Brooks, that part of the public concern here is about the closeness of the police and now politicians to News of the World and News International?
I think the public's concern overwhelmingly is on the interception of voicemails, is the idea that anybody could intercept the voicemails of victims of crime, and I think that's their overwhelming concern.
But there has been a lot of concern voiced over the closeness of police and politicians and News of the World and News International. Would you agree, as a matter of fact?
I've seen that the News of the World has been singled out for that closeness, and I think if you were going to address it, and you know this more than anyone on the committee because of your career as a journalist, that it is wholly unfair in discussing the closeness of police and politicians with the media to single out the News of the World.
Okay, but I mean, it is a fact that this has been a criticism, and yet you, on your watch as Chief Executive of News International, manage a triple whammy because you employ the former Director of Public Prosecutions to advise you on your approach to evidence and handing over to the police. And while he was the DPP, along with his successor, Ken MacDonald, was not above criticism for frankly rubber stamping the complacent police approach to the inquiry. Do you think that was an error of judgment, actually, given the circumstances?
I think just to clarify the Ken MacDonald issue, which I think is important, is that Ken MacDonald was hired by News Corporation, and he has been rigorous in his separation of payments to police and the illegal interception of voicemail. He has not commented in any shape or form on the illegal interception of voicemail, and if that conversation has arisen, he has withdrawn himself from the room and the conversation. So I hear what you say, but
you can forgive people for shaking their heads, can't you?
Well, I can forgive people for shaking their heads if they believe the question you put to me was true. But I think if people understand that he was hired by News Corporation, not News International, he's reporting directly into the board, and he's only discussing payments to police officers, then I don't think people would shake their heads. I mean, he has been rigorous in not involving himself in the illegal interception of voicemails.
I think we should call halt there. Unless you have anything else you'd like to add?
Just one thing, really, that I know you've heard unreserved apologies from Rupert and James Murdoch. I just want to reiterate my own. The most important thing that I feel going forward for the investigation is to discover the allegations, the truth behind the allegations, particularly for the Millie Dowler's family, but for the other allegations of victim of crime. But again, I would like to make just one request to the committee, that when I am free from some of the legal constraints that I'm under today, that you will invite me back so I can answer in a more fulsome way.
I think the committee would be very happy to accept that offer. In the meantime, can I thank you for your willingness to come and for the way in which you've answered our questions.
Thank you, Chairman.
Yeah, very briefly.